Hey there, GoPo students. Me again, doing the format that I don't like to do, but I'm here, and this is what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen. I'm hoping all of you are watching the other videos. I can't stress that enough, ladies and gentlemen, since I can't do live lessons. You need to go watch those other videos. Please, please, please. Go watch the bureaucracy videos. Go watch Federalist Paper number 78. Go watch Judicial Branch videos. Go watch the concept application writing guide on this one. So today is all about the argumentative essay. So remember, the AP test is 2 FRQs, free response questions: concept application, which I covered in another video that I just uploaded to YouTube yesterday or a couple days ago, and then argumentative essay. Both are going to be less time than what you're used to. The free response question concept application is normally 20 minutes. You're only going to get 15. The argumentative essay is normally 40 minutes. You're only going to get 25. The concept application format hasn't changed, just the time. The argumentative essay format has changed. And so not only do you have less time, but they also changed the original format of the argumentative essay that I taught you about how to do it. If you recall the argumentative essay, let me put up a screen share here of one of the argumentative essays here. So here's an example of an argumentative essay. I'm actually going to go through and answer this one for you so you can get an idea of this one. If you remember that it gives you a statement, you have to make a claim or a thesis of which you would get a point. You would have to get 2 pieces of evidence, one from a foundational document, or you could use 2, and then you could get a second piece from another document or from your own list. And then you had to use reasoning. So that was 1 point. This is 2 points. Then you had to give reasoning of how your evidence supported your thesis, and then you would have to do an alternative refuting argument. So they've changed it. This part is gone. You do not have to do a refutation, concession, or rebuttal argument for the other side. So that's gone. But they added where you now have to do 2 pieces of evidence, and then you have to do 2 reasonings for this. So what I want to do today is go over and show you a flowchart of how you're going to score points on the FRQ. The College Board put out something that looks like this. Oops. Let's go to this, screen share. What did I do here? Stop share. Okay. Let me show you a... Never mind on this. Okay. So let me show you the way I'm going to try and help you do the foundational document here. Show all windows. All right. So this is what I want you to look at when you're trying to understand how to do the FRQ, the argumentative essay FRQ. There's 7 points. So you have your claim or thesis. You get 1 point for that. And I'm going to go over examples of how to write a claim or a thesis. You're going to get 2 points for the documents or the source that you use to back up your thesis. 1 point has to be, one document has to be from the list. The other piece of evidence has to either be another foundational document or just something else we've learned in class. So you can use 2 documents that they give you, or you can use one of the documents they give you and then another source as your evidence. So here's 2 more points, okay? Now, this is where it gets confusing. You are going to basically give an idea of what this document is here, and then you're going to more fully explain what this document is here to get the second point. And I know that sounds confusing, and to tell you the truth, I'm a little confused about what they want here. So I'm going to do my best to clarify as we go through here. So 2 points for choosing documents which support your claim or thesis, 2 more points for showing you understand what the document is. So let's say, for example, you want to use the Constitution of the United States as your primary document. Then you would have to show that you understand what from the Constitution you would have to actually use, or what you're using to back it up your point, okay? And then remember, this third part here is reasoning. You're building a bridge which shows how your evidence supports your claim or thesis. Okay, I would like you to take a screenshot of this and print it out. So when you are writing your argumentative essay on the test, you have this to refer to. I did not make this. I actually found this online from somebody else, and I thought it did the best job of trying to explain how the new format of the argumentative essay is. What the College Board gave us was not very good, so I like this better. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a couple of different FRQs, argumentative essay, one from Unit 1 about the Constitution underpinnings, and then one from Unit 5 about presidential powers. And we're going to talk about what would get a point for each one. What would get a point for the thesis, what would get a point for the evidence, what would get a point for showing you understand the evidence, and what would get a point as to reasoning to show how your evidence supports your thesis. So we get 7 points total, okay? Now remember, the argumentative essay, I believe, is worth half of the test, but there's 7 points. So it's worth 50% of your grade, but yet there's 7 points on the FRQ. So that means that each point you score on here is 7 divided by 50, right? So each point you score on here is basically worth about 7%, because 7 times 7 is 49. So it's worth like 7.15%, something like that in that range, okay? So each one of these points is not worth as much as the concept application point. So remember, the concept application is only worth 3 points. So each point you score in the concept application is worth somewhere around 16.666% of your test. Each point you get here is only worth about 7.15% of your test, okay? Now, this is the easiest point. You just have to make your claim or thesis. Everybody should get this. Okay, this is an easy point. It's an underhand softball pitch that you should knock out of the park. So everybody should get at least that 1 point, okay? Everybody should be able to at least get 1 piece of evidence. I realize 2, some of you might blank a little bit, but you should be able to get 1 piece of evidence at least from the list of the documents that they give you. They're typically going to give you 3 documents to choose from. You should be able to find one of those documents that you can use to back up your thesis, okay? So, and the reasoning is we're going to build the bridge. We're going to connect the dots to explain how our document and the evidence that we have supports our thesis. So here, we're going to discuss what the document is. Here, we're going to show we actually understand what's in the document, okay? What is the document saying? And then here, we're going to show how what that document says is supporting our thesis. So 7 points total, okay? All right, so let's start off here and let's go with the necessary and proper clause. Just give me a second. Okay, I need to talk about this. So look at the question. It says, develop an argument to assess if the necessary and proper clauses have rendered state governments powerless. Why or why not? So we have to make a claim or a thesis which responds to this up here. Actually, let me make that there. Okay. So we have to make a claim or a thesis that either says, yes, the necessary and proper clause has rendered state governments powerless, or no, the necessary and proper clause has not rendered state governments powerless. Now, what I would like you to do is to define what the necessary and proper clause is in your thesis. So let's just take the argument that yes, they have. All right, so we're gonna take the argument and we're gonna develop a thesis that responds to this prompt. So here would be a point that you would get to say in arguing in the affirmative of this. Okay, so let's go. The necessary and proper clause gives the government all powers necessary and proper to carry out all the powers enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. The supremacy clause says that if the federal laws or enumerated powers ever conflict with state laws, then the federal law reigns supreme. We are going to argue in our thesis that the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause render the state governments powerless because the necessary and proper clause allows the federal government's powers to expand beyond what their enumerated powers are because it gives them implied powers. And the supremacy clause renders state governments powerless because the federal law will always trump or be supreme over the state law. Bam, we just scored a point. Okay, now that was probably way more than what you need to do to get the point on that, but we have very clearly established that we understand what the necessary and proper clause is. We have clearly established we know what the supremacy clause is, and we have clearly established why we think the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause make the state governments powerless. So now we have to go and support our claim with two pieces of evidence. Now you only need one to come from this list, okay? Now remember down here, let me skip ahead. This is not here. You don't have to, they're taking this part off for some reason. So you do not have to respond to an opposing argument. You do not have to rebuttal or refute an opposing argument. They've removed this from this year's, okay? So here's one point we just got. Now we have to make one piece of evidence that supports our claim, and one of them has to be from here. So let's pick, let's say the Brutus number 1. Okay, we could argue that Brutus number 1 is proving our point that the necessary and proper clause and supremacy clause have rendered state governments powerless. Now, let's talk about what Brutus number 1 is. Brutus number 1 was a paper written in response to the Federalist Papers trying to convince the voters not to vote for or to ratify the Constitution. So Brutus number 1 was written under the pseudonym Brutus number 1, and it was in response to the Federalist Papers trying to convince voters not to ratify the new Constitution. Okay, so we're just kind of laying out the point that here's what Brutus number 1 is. We're just describing what Brutus number 1 is. It's just an essay written to try to convince the people of the United States not to ratify the new Constitution and replace the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so we're just giving that, and we just scored a point there because we just said we're using Brutus number 1, and we're telling what Brutus number 1 is, and we're trying to also clearly show that we know what Brutus number 1 is, okay? By saying it's an essay written to convince the people of the United States of America to not ratify the new Constitution in response to the Federalist Papers. Okay, now we need to go on and clearly state what are some arguments that were used in Brutus number 1. Well, if you remember Brutus number 1, the arguments used were that the necessary and proper clause, or also called the elastic clause, was going to give governments a basically unlimited amount of powers because it would give them implied powers that are not enumerated in the Constitution. That was one of the main arguments used in Brutus number 1, was that the necessary and proper clause would allow the federal government to grow so big it would eventually dwarf all state powers. He made the same argument about the supremacy clause and the commerce clause, that the supremacy clause and the commerce clause, although we don't need to use the commerce clause here, we could actually use that as our second piece of evidence, that Brutus number 1 said the supremacy clause would allow the federal government to just supersede or override all state government powers. Okay, so now we have clearly stated what evidence from Brutus number 1, so this is our down here. I'm going to come back to, let me come back to my other screen share. We just stated that we understand the evidence in the document. Okay, so we explain what Brutus number 1 is. We got a point for that. We showed some evidence so we understand what's in the document, explaining what they said about the necessary and proper clause and that, and the worry of that. Now we have to build the bridge. We have to connect the dots about Brutus number 1. Okay, so how do we do that? We are going to say, since Brutus number 1 argued that the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause would both override state government powers, the necessary and proper clause gives the government implied powers to allow the federal government to grow beyond what the original intent of the framers was in the enumerated powers. And the supremacy clause would always trump any state law that gets passed. And since Brutus number 1 has made these arguments, we are showing that Brutus number one is supporting our thesis. Come back to our thesis here. Brutus number one is, we are now showing reasoning to connect the bridge that we made a thesis that the necessary and proper clause and supremacy clause has rendered state governments powerless. Okay, so we used evidence, Brutus number one. We showed what Brutus number one is. Let me come back to this here. We've shown we understood what was in Brutus number one, and then we just connected the dots to show that because Brutus number one argued this, we are showing that that is a document to support our thesis that the necessary and proper clause and supremacy clause is too strong and would make state government powers useless. Okay, so I went sort of fast there, but I'm going to do it again with another piece of evidence here. Okay, so now we can make our own evidence if we want to, or we can use another foundational document to make our point. Okay, so either way, we can do that. You can use a quote from somebody else. You can use another primary document that we've used. You can use a court case if you want to, ladies and gentlemen. So one sort of court case that if we wanted to use in this could be, say, McCulloch versus Maryland, right? Another court case that we might be able to use to prove this might be, say, if we were actually arguing the other way, if we were arguing that the necessary and proper clause has not rendered state governments powerless, if we were trying to argue the other way, a court case that we could use in here could be U.S. versus Lopez. So if we weren't arguing that necessary and proper clause and supremacy clause does not render state governments powerless, a different piece of evidence we could use would be U.S. versus Lopez. Remember U.S. versus Lopez, so we would have to identify that piece of evidence. So if I was coming this way, we could say U.S. versus Lopez court case proves that the necessary and proper clause and supremacy clause do not render state governments powerless or useless. So we would then have to understand and show that we know what U.S. versus Lopez is. And we would have to say U.S. versus Lopez is about a piece of legislation called the Guns Free School Zone Act. And then if you remember us talking about U.S. versus Lopez and the Guns Free School Zone Act, we could say that the Guns Free School Zone Act was an attempt by the federal government to use the Commerce Clause to override state authority of passing gun laws. And that was taken to court by the state governments, and the state and the Supreme Court overruled the Guns Free School Zone Act. We would have to use reasoning now. We would say because the federal courts overruled the use of the Commerce Clause by the federal government and the Guns Free School Zone Act, we could see that Congress does not have an unlimited amount of implied powers given to it by the necessary and proper clause. And it shows here that the supremacy clause, that the federal law did not overpower state law in this instance in the Guns Free School Zone Act. So we could argue that the U.S. versus Lopez, so I'm switching sides now. We could argue that in U.S. versus Lopez, that the supremacy clause did not take into effect. We could argue that even though the Congress had the use of the Commerce Clause and tried to use that to pass the Guns Free School Zone Act, the state laws superseded the federal law, and so the supremacy clause did not render state governments powerless. So there's a second way. If we were arguing the other way, we could use another primary document. Is everybody with me on that? Make sense? Any questions? Go ahead. Oh, that's right. You're not here. Okay. What else could I say? All right. Let's argue that. Let's go down to this now. Okay. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is sort of a quick way of which I just tried to explain to you how that works. I tried to show you that how we make a thesis, how we could pick the document and just basically give a brief description of what the document is. Here, we're going into more detail of what's in the document or the evidence that we're using. And here, we're connecting or building a bridge to show how that document or that evidence supports our thesis. Okay, so let's do another one here. Cranberry juice. I hope you guys like it. Okay, let's go to this one here. So here's another argumentative essay. Again, the refutation, concession, or rebuttal to respond is gone. That's not going to be on there. Okay? So let's go through and let's read the quote together. In April 2017, President Trump informed Congress of his plans to launch 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting the airbase from which Syrian President Bashar al-Assad launched a chemical weapons attack against his own people, killing more than 80 women and children. According to a CBS News report, Senator Mike Lee from Utah insisted that if the U.S. increased the use of military force in Syria, we should follow the Constitution and seek proper authorization from Congress. Kentucky lawmakers Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, both Republicans, agreed with Senator Mike Lee. Develop an argument that explains whether or not the president has the power to order an airstrike without congressional approval. Okay, so we either have to argue in the affirmative, the president does have the power to order an airstrike without congressional approval, or the president does not have the power to order an airstrike without congressional approval. Okay, so now let's go ahead and come back to this here. Let's make a claim or a thesis that supports one argument. Which one do we want to do here? Do we want to support the president does have the power or the president doesn't have the power? Okay, well, based off what we see here, we're going to say the president does have the power. Okay, let's take that one. All right, so let's make a thesis on this. Our claim or our thesis is going to say this: the president does have the power to order an airstrike without congressional approval, and we are going to say the president does not need the authorization of Congress in order to have an airstrike against a country. So we are making our very clear thing. We're not just restating the thesis here. We're making a claim the president of the United States does not have to or have congressional authorization to order an airstrike without getting presidential approval. Okay? Now, we have to put a line of reasoning in there. And we could just say, because the president is the commander-in-chief, the president does not need congressional authorization before the president orders an airstrike. We just gave reasoning right there. Okay? Now, we have to use two pieces of evidence. Let's come back to the graphic here. We need to have two pieces of evidence to show that the president does not need congressional authorization to order an airstrike. One has to be from this primary document list. You can use both of these if you want to. Okay? You can use both of your evidence from this document list, but only one is necessary to come from this. Okay? The other one can just be another piece of evidence that can come from someplace else. So let's go ahead and let's start off with Federalist Paper number 70. Okay? So we're doing our first document. We're going to say in Federalist Paper number 70, Hamilton argued that we needed a strong single executive. In Federalist Paper number 70, Hamilton made the case that the president should be the commander-in-chief by themselves and not be a committee of people. All right, so we just kind of talked about what Federalist Paper number 70 is, and we just got that point right there. Now, point number two, we need to show the evidence that we understand what Hamilton was talking about in Federalist Paper number 70. So we've talked about what Fed 70 is. It's Hamilton arguing for a single strong executive and to have one person be the commander-in-chief. Now let's talk more about why Hamilton argued that we need a single strong executive and one person to be the commander-in-chief, not done by a committee. So Hamilton would argue this. In Fed 70, Hamilton argues that in times of war or in times of extreme situations, we need a single person with the authority to act, and they can act decisively and not done by committee. If we have a committee of people, that Hamilton argued, then they would deliberate. They would not sometimes act decisively enough. If we had a committee of people or more than one executive, say a dual executive, then they might be trying to exert their own power over the other one instead of actually trying to do what's best for the country. If we had a dual executive, they might not act in the best interest of the nation or act decisively because there would be other factors that would cause them to hesitate to act decisively because they wouldn't be a single executive. So if you remember us talking about Fed 70, Hamilton was arguing that one person needs to be a single executive so they can act decisively. They don't have to deliberate with another person. There wouldn't be any competing interest of another person who they would have to convince to do this with. And we are now showing, so blam, we just got the second point there, because we just showed that we understand what Federalist Paper 70 was arguing of why the president should have the authority to not have to ask Congress to do a strike, of a missile strike. Now, the reasoning we're going to do this, okay? We're basically going to reiterate what Hamilton said right here. We're basically going to say, excuse me, Hamilton argues that we want to have a single executive as a commander-in-chief that should not have to deliberate from Congress or another body to do an airstrike, because we want somebody who can act swiftly in times of crisis. We need a president who can make a decision and act without having to deliberate when the commander-in-chief position calls for it. And so by using Hamilton's argument, we are showing that Fed 70 is supporting our thesis that the president does not have to get permission from Congress in order to airstrike, because the president is the commander-in-chief, a single executive. They were given that authority to act decisively so they don't have to deliberate when the times call for it, when there is a time of crisis, when we're in a military situation. So there we go. We now have 1, 2, 3, 4 points out of 7 for that. Okay, let's go back to the question. Okay, so we could choose the Constitution of the United States, if we wanted to, as our second piece of evidence. We could argue that Article 2 makes the president commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief gets to decide on military action. We could go that way, right, if we wanted to, okay? We could choose Federalist Paper number 51, and we could say that no, the president, if you remember, Federalist Paper number 51 was explaining about how checks and balances will not allow any one branch to get too powerful. And you could argue that the president does not need the power of Congress to order an airstrike, because if the president acts unconstitutionally with their authority as a commander-in-chief, there are multiple ways of which that president can be reined in as a commander-in-chief, like impeachment. Actions can be declared unconstitutional by the judicial branch, things like that. If you were arguing that the president does not have the power to order an airstrike, you could argue Federalist 51 as well, that no, checks and balances require the president to get authorization from Congress. So you could go that way too. I'm going to go off of this list here. I'm not going to use this one, and I'm going to use something called the War Powers Resolution. Everybody remember the War Powers Act from Unit 5, talk about the President Congress? So let's go back over to this. So as a second piece of evidence, I'm not going to use that, one of the primary documents, I'm going to talk about the War Powers Act. And we're going to say the War Powers Act allows the president to conduct missile airstrikes without congressional authorization. The War Powers Act is a piece of legislation which clearly defined what the president can and cannot do as the commander-in-chief. So we've just scored our 5th point right there. Now, let's show evidence that we understand what the War Powers Act is, okay? Remember, the War Powers Act says that the president, if the president is going to act in a military action without congressional authorization, the president just needs to inform Congress within 48 hours. We are now supporting this up here real quick. The War Powers Act also says if the president sends troops anywhere around the world, those troops have to come back within 60 to 90 days. And if those troops engage in any military attacks, then those troops need congressional authorization before they can do that. Now, we are going to use reasoning to show how the War Powers Act supports our thesis the president does not need congressional authorization. The War Powers Act says that the president can send troops whenever and wherever the president wants to, and as long as the president just informs Congress within 48 hours, then the president has the military authority to do that. We could argue that the president was not sending troops in by ordering a missile strike, and therefore those troops are not actively engaged in combat, and as long as the president just informs Congress within 48 hours, that the War Powers Act allows the president to order missile strikes without getting congressional authorization first. Okay? Now, we could actually flip it and go the other way. We could argue that if we were saying that the president does not allowed to do missile strikes, we could actually use the War Powers Act to argue in favor of that as well. So let's say we made a claim or thesis that the president does need congressional authorization to fire off missile strikes before the president can do that. We could say the War Powers Act does not allow the president to have troops engage in offensive military strikes without congressional authorization first. Obviously, troops can engage in defensive military altercations, but not offensive. And we could argue that because the president needs congressional authorization to engage in offensive military tactics, then we would be saying the War Powers Act does not allow the president to have troops fire off Tomahawk missiles without authorization of Congress, because those troops are now engaged in offensive military tactics. So I could flip it around and use the War Powers Act to argue in favor and against the thesis each way it goes. Okay, so this is a couple of different examples of writing a argumentative essay, ladies and gentlemen. Again, this is gone now. Okay, this part right here has been taken out. No rebuttal necessary. Okay, you do have to use two pieces of evidence. One has to be from the primary document list right here. Both of them can be from the primary document list if you want to use them. Okay, so notice here it says use a second piece of evidence from another foundational document or from your study. So if you're comfortable using two of these foundational documents, go ahead and use them. But if you only know one of these and you have something else you could use, you could go ahead and do that too. Okay, all right, so I'm going to stop my screen share here. Okay, so that's writing the argumentative essay under the new format, ladies and gentlemen. I have posted many different examples on both Schoology and Google Classroom. I posted a bunch of different argumentative essays. In fact, I made a list out here on Google Classroom. I think I posted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think I posted 10 different argumentative essays on Google Classroom between units 1, 2, 5, and 6. So there's plenty of practice examples you can do on there. Same thing with concept application, ladies and gentlemen. I think I posted in the range of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, about 13, I think, concept application practice FRQs. The best way I know how to do this, ladies and gentlemen, is practice, 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 practice. Okay? Practice as much as you can, and have this printed out in front of you. Have your primary documents list that we saved in our Google Drive, have all those printed out in front of you. Remember, we went over all these primary documents: Federalist Paper number 10, Federalist Paper 51, Federalist Paper 70, Federalist Paper 78, the Declaration of Independence, your Constitution that you have, that you did your constitutional summary on, have that printed out, letter from Birmingham jail, have all those printed out in front of you and ready to go before you take the test, okay? Also, court case summaries, have those all printed out in front of you before you take the test, okay? The next video I'm gonna post is I'm actually gonna start reviewing units 1 and units 2. And I am going to put up the document of which I'm gonna review from Schoology. I'll show you where it's at on Schoology, and I'll have you print that out and go through that, because I want you to have all those documents open too. Okay, again, email me if you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry, this is the format that I have. I don't like this format. I like to be in front of you, talking to you, asking you questions, checking for understanding, and more clearly going over these, but this is what we have. So contact me anytime. I hope all of you are doing well, and hopefully I hear from you soon. All right, take care.